Hey guys, welcome to Y&R Daily Update YouTube channel. Today's topics: The Young and the Restless recap Monday, full May 25, 2025. Claire's slap-shocked fury was still reverberating through Genoa City when another front in the city's quiet war began to open, this one moving on a corporate axis that touched almost everyone by one remove. The first tremor arrived at Chancellor Winters, where Lily Winters, already bracing herself against the uneasy headlines surrounding Victor and Kane, called Holden Novak into her office and closed the door with a decisive click that told him there would be no friendly detours. The tension between them had nothing to do with rumor and everything to do with risk. Holden had been orbiting people and projects that now seemed to sit squarely in the crosshairs of men who considered leverage a language, not a tactic. Lily's questions were precise. When had Holden last seen Kane? What exactly had been discussed about consulting? Why had certain outreach lists placed him in proximity to Claire and a small constellation of Newman and Abbott interests? And what harmless check-ins had lately multiplied into patterns that looked a lot less like coincidence and a lot more like reconnaissance? Holden, equal parts candid and key, tried to keep his balance on a floor that kept subtly tilting. He admitted to introductions that had seemed routine, dinners that had felt polite until they began to feel strategic, and a handful of favors that now read like early moves in someone else's game. Lily listened without blinking, measuring every syllable, filing it against a private ledger of who might hurt her company next and how quickly. She would need to move to keep the damage theoretical. She was not hunting gossip. She was isolating variables, because in Genoa, city reputations could be mended, but supply chains and launch calendars could not, and the clock on Abbott Communications' debut was ticking with the merciless regularity of a metronome. Across town in an office that seemed to hold echoes of 1,000 previous arguments, Nick Newman and Adam Newman sat down to do the thing they were both good at and both sick of: dissect the pros and cons of their father's latest plan as if it were a patient on a table they couldn't refuse to operate on. The intelligence was straightforward. Victor had maneuvered himself into close proximity with Kane. Not in a public boardroom or a convenient jet, but on a private train. A moving cocoon that turned distance into privacy and motion into cover. Pros: control the environment, limit leaks, transform a confrontation into an encounter framed as destiny rather than ambush, and keep any blowback away from cameras and corridors where rivals could eavesdrop. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Cons: escalate a conflict with a man who had already demonstrated an appetite for escalation. Catalyze collateral damage that would inevitably bleed into adjacent brands. Chancellor Winters, and yes, Abbott Communications. And risk reminding every stakeholder from investors to family that the Newman method still prized victory over peace. Nick leaned toward the argument that stability demands boundaries, that one more controlled burn near the family's perimeter could scorch their own house. Adam leaned as ever toward the precision strike, the chess move that accepted hazard now, to prevent a worse hazard later, even as he privately admitted that the board was crowded with wildcards. Both brothers understood that their analysis would neither restrain nor accelerate Victor. The real function of their debate was to anticipate where the tremors would land so they could build braces in advance. The day's strange optimism belonged to Sally Spectra, who arrived at Billy Abbott's place carrying garment bags that looked like banners and a kind of laughter that blew the dust off the last few grim weeks. Abbott Communications' launch was finally close enough to taste. And if there was nervous electricity in her hands, there was also joy. The kind that only shows up when a designer sees a runway in her head and a headline on the horizon. In the living room, she built a miniature stage. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. First, a modern sheath that captured light without begging for it. Then, a slinkier silhouette that whispered risk. And finally the third. An exquisite navy velvet that seemed to pull the room's oxygen into its fold and then release it as applause. Billy, who had once lost the knack for letting good things feel good, found it again as he watched her move. He told her she looked gorgeous, all breath and grin, and meant it like a promise. They talked launch logistics and signature beats, and the odd fact that responsibility and thrill can occupy the same square inch of ribcage. And for a precious interval, the world narrowed to fabric, angles, and the feeling of being a team with momentum. Sally asked which dress told the best version of her story, and he picked the velvet, because it turned ambition into posture and nerves into glamour. And when she confessed that excitement sometimes braided itself with fear, he answered with the simplest vow he had. Step by step, he would be there, not to carry her, but to steady the ground. The spell broke on a vibration. Billy's phone lit with the name of a private investigator, and the room's temperature dropped half a degree. He listened, a frown traveling from his eyes to his jawline, and asked the question you ask when you already suspect the answer. Do you have something on Kane? And when he hung up, he told Sally the headline. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Victor and Kane were together on a private train. Out of sight, out of reach, and in motion toward a conclusion no one could yet name. Sally's mind leaped ahead of the facts to the implications. If Kane realized Abbott Communications had been quietly watching him, if he traced even one thread back to Billy, the response would not be confined to a nasty phone call. Kane's version of warfare was rarely theatrical. It was precise, systemic, and commercially indifferent to collateral. The brand she had poured her talent into could become a battlefield without a single public skirmish. Killed not by rumor but by interrupted freight, sabotaged ad inventory, a whisper campaign that curdled investor nerves, or a delivery glitch engineered to make brilliance look like incompetence. Lily's second pass at Holden was less interview than stress test. She laid out in careful neutral language how a certain pattern of meetings and introductions could be construed by a clever adversary as the preface to infiltration, how the wrong person could weaponize a perfect misunderstanding, and how she refused to allow Chancellor Winters to become the staging ground for anyone's proxy war. She was fair, not gentle. She acknowledged that Holden's proximity to several volatile nodes might have been more naivete than design. But she also made it clear that naivete is a luxury industries cannot carry when launches are counting down and supply chains are a single outage away from embarrassment. Holden's reply was the small important kind. He would remove himself from any corridor where his presence could be misread. He would flag anomalies before instinct turned them into anecdote, and he would accept without sulking or self-defense that the grown-up thing to do sometimes looks like absence. Lily nodded once, the kind of nod people give when they appreciate both the decision and the fact that it took courage to make it. And then, because she is as practical as she is protective, she escalated her own mitigations, duplicate vendor pathways, staggered freight for the Abbott Communications reveal, pre-written messaging that could be deployed within minutes if an outage tried to paint incompetence on competence, and a quiet heads up to Billy that wasn't panic but prudence. In Genoa City, crisis managers don't wait for crisis. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. They assemble antidotes and label them just in case. Nick and Adam's analysis bled into a decision tree. If Victor's train gambit resulted in détente, they would still have to play defense against a counterstrike from the man who never accepted mere survival as a win. If it resulted in rupture, they would be triaging for days, maybe weeks. Nick pushed for a courtesy warning to Billy on the logic that cross-family courtesy inoculates against long grudges. Adam, remembering a dozen moments when transparency had been read as interference, argued for a narrower channel, advised Sally through a back door she could choose to ignore without feeling Both brothers were haunted by a single unspoken reality. Their father's plan, whether brilliant or reckless, sat on the same tracks as multiple other people's livelihoods, and the risk calculus for men with last names that doubled as corporate logos was not the same as it was for everyone else. In the end, they split the difference. A cautious pulse to a mutual friend would travel faster than a memo and softer than a siren. At the same time, Adam sent a message Sally would recognize as his short on drama, long on implication, check redundancies, assume a stress event, treat gossip like a fuse. Sally read it, felt the hair rise on her arms, and thanked him with a heart she pretended not to mean. Sally and Billy built their own defense like designers, because that is who they are. Not with paranoia, but with architecture. They mapped critical dependencies, rehearsed a launch day follow-over plan, treated messaging as a choreography that could pivot mid-step without looking like a stumble. Sally called the velvet dress not just a look, but a thesis-resilient fabric with a depth that photographs can't fake. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. And she applied the same principle to their rollout. Resilient schedules, depth of creative assets, nothing brittle. And she applied the same principle to their rollout. Resilient schedules, depth of creative assets, nothing brittle enough to snap when squeezed. Billy, chastened by too many seasons of letting the adrenaline choose the move, chose the boring virtues, confirmations, checklists, backups parked in boring folders with boring names because dull preparation is how you beat spectacular sabotage. The PI's update replayed in the back of his skull like a refrain. A private train means a timetable means a climax. and climaxes are where men like Kane either make deals or make messes. If the night ended with silence, good. If the night ended with someone deciding to prove a point, he wanted Abbott Communications quiet, ready, and boring enough to be uninteresting to vandals. On that moving steel corridor, cutting the distance between cities into increments of strategy, Victor and Kane did what men of their species always do. Tested whether respect could replace fear, without sacrificing leverage. Victor presented outcomes the way a veteran pilot talks about weather, fronts, pressures, safe corridors, and the consequences of ignoring all three. Kane carried himself like a man who had learned the hard way that compromise is often just prelude to capture. Yet even he recognized the arithmetic. An all-out war would litter the tracks with parts neither man could reassemble before rivals took souvenirs. The conversation did not bloom into trust, but it did harden into clarity. Each left the car knowing exactly how far the other would go, and exactly how much of the city would shake if either of them pushed past that line. And because there are always other ears, someone listened who was not supposed to. Someone who believed that markets prefer predictability, and that the fastest route to it was removing noisy variables. The message would arrive elsewhere as a glitch, a misrouting, a momentary outage. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. In truth, it would be a tap on the glass to remind everyone that not all hands were visible. Nightfall pulled strands together. Holden, honoring the promise he just made to Lily, texted Claire a brief, careful goodbye to the casual proximity that had started to look like a headline. Then drove alone until the city gave way to the road to thought, leaving behind a version of himself that hadn't yet learned the cost of being adjacent to power. Lily, satisfied that the first layer of defenses was in place, walked the darkened halls of a building that smelled like coffee and ambition, and told herself that vigilance is not fear, it is love spelled in spreadsheets. Nick poured a final drink he did not really want, and sent a final text he hoped he wouldn't regret. Adam closed an app and opened a blank note labeled contingencies, because hope without a plan is just optimism on stilts. Billy sat with Sally on a couch that had become a control room, the garment bags now standing like centuries over the next few days of their lives, and they ran the launch again in their heads, this time with interruptions. This time with bad actors. This time with the grace to imagine failure without inviting it in for dinner. When her phone buzzed with a routine calendar alert, both of them jumped anyway, then laughed at themselves. Then stopped laughing because experience had taught them that flinching is how the body says it wants to live. The first ripple arrived, where it always does, somewhere no one is looking because everyone is staring at the big red circle on the calendar. A content distribution node serving a narrow but critical slice of Abbott Communications, pre-roll inventory blinked, sputtered, and came back speaking in gibberish. 90 seconds later, a redundant path took the load and no one outside the room even noticed, but Sally marked it with a pin and Billy called it out loud so it had a name. 10 minutes after that, a supplier in a different time zone sent a cheerful confirmation in a tone that felt just a little too cheerful. The kind of email that smells like a man trying to seem unremarkable. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. As they were triaging small oddities, Lily's just-in-case note landed, short, elegant, entirely free of panic, and invited them to imagine what it would look like to look brilliant, even if they had to launch around a pothole. Somewhere, in the middle of it all, the velvet dress hung, quiet and regal, a reminder that the point of the work was still the work. Sally touched the fabric like a talisman and smiled without needing to fake it. By the time midnight's stillness settled into the city, all the separate threads were humming. The private train sliding through darkness toward a decision whose terms had been set by two men and shadow amended by a third. Lily's company, pulsing with quiet redundancies that made the building feel like a heartbeat. The Newman brothers, waiting for impact like surfers who can tell by the sky what the ocean will do next. Holden, practicing the virtue of distance and learning that sometimes leaving a room is how you keep from breaking the furniture, and Billy and Sally sitting shoulder less afraid than they had been 2 hours ago, because preparation has a way of lowering the temperature of a room. If the night ended with nothing, they would sleep a little and wake to fittings, walkthrifts, media grids, and the kind of nerves you earn by building something you want the world to see. If the night ended with something, well, then they would discover whether all their contingency rehearsals were art or architecture. Either way, the next chapter had already opened, and the city had already leaned closer. And then the text arrived. That wasn't a text so much as an intent disguised as logistics. A rail ETA pushed forward by an hour. A signature shared between two men who did not usually share anything that couldn't be spun later. And a single 7-word note from a source no one would ever admit existed. When stories collide, publish, first or perish. Billy read it twice, the PI's name glowing at the top of the screen like a dare. Sally exhaled and squared her shoulders because that is what people do when they choose momentum over dread. Lily's phone vibrated on a desk in an empty office, and Nick and Adam, in separate rooms, with the same last name, understood in the same second that tomorrow's headlines would not be written in ink, but in posture. Somewhere the velvet caught a sliver of streetlight and looked almost liquid. Somewhere steel cut the night cleanly and without apology, and everywhere, the same lesson announced itself to anyone willing to hear it. The point is not to avoid the collision. Genoa City runs on collisions, but to decide before the dust who you are when the cameras turn on. Adam arrived at the Newman Ranch with the kind of resolve that comes from a sleepless night and a decision made in the stern light of dawn. The gravel under his tires snapping like punctuation as he killed the engine and rehearsed for the last time the argument he intended to make. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He cut through the foyer toward the study and asked the only question that mattered. Where Victor was, because everything else could wait. When told his father was in transit, the phrase tasted like a riddle he already knew the answer to. Victor, in motion meant a plan in motion, and plans in motion rarely yielded to second thoughts. Adam refused to accept that inertia as fate. He found Nick instead, and standing in the doorway, as though it were a line he would cross only if heard fairly, said he wanted to talk about Kane, about the alliance, about the supposed hunt for Zyabo, that had begun to feel less like strategy and more like an unforced error. I've thought about it, he said, voice even but edged, and I think it's a mistake. He laid it out with more discipline than his critics ever credit him with. An alliance with Kane is an alliance with volatility. It sends the wrong signal to regulators and rivals. It invites chaos into a house that survives uncontrolled storms. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. It risks dragging the family brand into the wake of a man who treats scorched earth as hobby, not hazard. And for what? Exactly, a temporary tactical advantage against Jabo that could be achieved by cleaner means. Adam wanted Nick to help him intervene, to make the argument that sometimes refusing an expedient move is the only way to keep from detonating your own floorboards. It was not sentiment, it was arithmetic. Nick listened with the patience of a man who has rehearsed being the family's shock absorber and replied with the steadiness that makes people call him reasonable even when he feels anything but. He told Adam to trust their father's raid on the board and then did something unexpected. He opened a door into a piece of context Adam didn't have. Back in Nice, when he and Sharon were trapped in that ornate cage of a castle, they'd found traces, names in a ledger, a chain of title crossing borders with the flexibility of smoke. Footnotes about previous owners whose fortunes rose and fell with suspicious synchronicity that suggested the property had been more than architectural vanity. It had been a waystation for transactions no one wanted to happen in daylight. A clearinghouse where loyalty could be bought or retired. Victor's plan, Nick suggested, might not be about helping Kane hunt so much as taking a hunt that was already happening and bending its vector to reveal a different quarry. The castle and the men who owned it before, Nick said carefully, are not trivia. It wasn't a lecture. It was a reminder that their father sometimes sailed through storms other men didn't know existed. Charting courses using stars no one else could see. Did that make the gamble safe? No, but it did change the frame. Adam, to his credit, absorbed the new data without flinching, even as the counter-argument built. No, but it did change the frame. Adam, to his credit, absorbed the new data without flinching, even as the counterargument built itself inside his skull. There are gamels that sharpen and gamels that fray, and the difference is not always visible until the bill comes due. He walked the room, palms pressed into pockets as if trying to keep his own temper from climbing out. Trust, Victor, Nick said. Trust the man who, for all his many sins, had a record of surviving the very calamities he caused. But Adam's instincts, his cursed useful instincts, kept pointing to the same fault lines. Kane, when cornered, does not negotiate from strength. He improvises from panic and calls it swagger. Kane in alliance means Kane in the walls, and whatever objective Victor had borrowed for the week, Kane would smuggle his own. Adam could concede the nice intel and still contend that the vector was wrong. You do not borrow a fuse from the man most likely to light it out of spite. What Adam wanted from Nick wasn't blind agreement. It was a second set of brakes, The kind you install, not because you distrust the driver, but because you respect physics. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. They went a few rounds the way brothers who have fought for decades can. Hard on the logic and soft on the heart. Nick reminding Adam that sometimes their father uses their doubt as calibration. Adam reminding Nick that sometimes their father misreads his own appetite. In the end, Nick promised to carry the caution upstream at the first clean chance. And Adam promised not to freelance a sabotage of the alliance, unless the alliance threatened to blow the doors off the house. They both recognized it for what it was. Not a truce exactly, but a shared choice to be ready when the next door opened. Across town, Crimson Lights was halfway through its morning rush when Lily Winters intercepted Kane with the calm precision of someone who has decided that today is the day a conversation will stop circling inland. She asked him without preamble or theatrical scorn why he'd hidden the contours of his plan and whether the hiding came from strategy or fear. Kane parried at first, offering the kind of evasions men in his position always think they invented. Timelines, moving parts, the danger of speaking too soon. But Lily did not blink. She was not auditing his ambition. She was measuring the distance between the man he said he was and the choices he was making. The talk, as it always did when they exhausted the corporate vocabulary, leaned into the personal. She told him what he already knew, but refused to sit still long enough to feel that Maddie and Charlie were old enough to translate silence as betrayal. That they were not asking for perfection, but for honesty. That when a father elects secrecy over trust, he teaches his children the exact grammar of the wound. They will spend their 30s trying to forgive. The words landed not because they were shouted, but because they were true. Kane's jaw worked. He reached for argument and came up with rationale. That cheaper cousin of reason, and knew it as he spoke. The moment cracked when Victor rounded the corner, as if he had been part of the conversation all along. Said he needed a word with Kane and waited. Lily slid her bag farther up under her arm, as if cinching armor, and looked at Kane in a way that made the coffee shop vanish. "They LL, remember how you choose," she said, and left him there to choose. She cut through the afternoon toward the park because movement helps people metabolize fury, and she had no intention of letting her anger turn to helplessness. The bag, the one her friends joked could hold a week's groceries and a spare life, rested against her abdomen like a shield. She had earned and didn't have to explain. The air was clean in the way, city air is only between storms, and she almost didn't see Holden until he was close enough to call her name with a tentative hopefulness that told her the distance he meant to keep had already shortened. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. He told her he'd taken the job with Kane. That the offer had come packaged in urgency and possibility, that he'd be based in Genoa City for the foreseeable future. For half a breath, she said nothing, because every version of a speech she might give him ended in a different variety of bruise. Honesty won. She told him she thought he would regret it, and not because the work would be unworthy. Kane did not build failing systems, but because proximity to Kane deforms people's sense of consequence. He will make you better at the immediate, she said, and worse at the important. She didn't sell fear, she sketched a map. Rule 1. Write down the promises you make yourself before you start because he will give you chances to break them that look like promotion. Rule 2. Build your exits while you're still happy because leaving angry doubles the damage. Rule 3. If he asks you to keep a secret that would humiliate you if your kids read it one day, that's not a secret, that's a trap. Holden absorbed it quietly, the way men who have learned the cost of pride learn to listen when truth is offered without contempt. He thanked her without defending himself, and promised because he is not foolish even when he is ambitious to keep enough of himself outside the machine to recognize his own reflection when he woke up. Back at the coffee shop, Kane folded the part of himself that hurt under the part that keeps him standing, and followed Victor out into a pocket of privacy. That might as well have been a confessional. The power dynamic between them had never been simple. Mentor and opponent, braided with equal tension, drawn together by the gravity that drags planets into orbits they can't escape. Victor talked about timets and corridors, about the way motion can be used to hide intention, about how allies often serve best as mirrors that reflect a rival's worst angles. Kane talked about outcomes and about lines he would not cross in public even if he had crossed them in private. About how narratives calcify faster than facts when names like theirs are involved. They did not agree on what to call the thing they were about to do: hunt, recalibration, negotiation, trap. But they agreed on the rules: keep it out of the papers, out of the markets, and as far away as possible from the people whose love is not a currency. What neither man said, because men like this do not give fear air, was that an alliance between them creates a silhouette that invites snipers, and snipers do not schedule press conferences. At Newman, Nick tried to balance useful transparency with the instinct to avoid pouring gasoline on embers. He relayed the nice context to Adam in fuller color, including the suspicion that one of the castle's previous owners had used a shell tied to a European cosmetics distributor that once circled Jabal like a shark that never quite bit. If that thread was real, and he stressed that Victor chased patterns, not phantoms, then the current hunt could be a pressure test on a pipeline that still exists beneath newer concrete. Adam granted the possibility while refusing the comfort. Even if the target is right, he said the tool is wrong. He saw too clearly what would happen if Kane added his signature to any memo that even looked like a strike at Jabbo. The narrative would write itself? And when narratives write themselves, they flatten nuance into villains and martyrs, and leave no room for the half-truth that saves face. Nick asked the only question that matters in families and in wars. What would you do, instead? And Adam answered with restraint that almost surprised himself. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Slow the play. Widen the net. Act through third parties who don't carry our name on their letterhead or their foreheads. The goal, he argued, is to smoke out the pipeline, not to install Kane at the valve. Nick didn't promise to sell the pivot, but he didn't dismiss it either. He made the quiet commitment he can live with at night. He'd be in the room when the choice was made, and he'd speak the caution in a tone meant to be heard. By late afternoon, the city's choreography had everyone in motion toward the next necessary place. Lily returned to Chancellor Winters and translated worry into systems, the way people who love their companies translate grief into checklists. She pushed her teams to assume interference in design beauty anyway to build the Abbott Communications launch like a stage that could survive a power flicker without betraying the performer. Kane took a call that changed his route by an inch, and as a result, his chances by a mile. Victor received an update that reaffirmed his sense that the nice ledger was not a ghost story, but a live wire hovering beneath a floor the market assumed was safe. Adam drove without music and composed in his head the kind of argument you offer someone you love who has taught you to argue in the language of results. Nick found Sharon's number on his screen without remembering pressing it and asked her for the one thing she offers better than anyone, whether he was missing a human truth because he was busy sorting the tactical ones. Holden opened a fresh legal pad and wrote his 3 rules at the top. Because sometimes, writing your name under a promise is how you keep the promise from turning into an excuse. Evening loosened the edges of the day and the collisions sharpened. Victor and Kane took their discussion into a corridor of logistics that felt more like choreography. What to show, what to hold, which phone to leave at home on which day, which intermediary to employ so that deniability had teeth and not just a smile, if they were to pressure the channel that ran from a relic in nice to a present-tense competitor. They would do it with restraint that looked like politeness and force that looked like luck. Victor explained in the patient tone of a man who has sold Victor explained in the patient tone of a man who has sold 100 ambitious men on patience that the prize wasn't the humiliation of Jabbo, it was the exposure of a mechanism that once outed would stop poisoning the room for everyone. Kane accepted the construct while refreshing the internal lockboxes, where he kept his non-negotiables, because he knows the choreography of cooperation can become the quicksand of subjugation if you don't keep your weight on the balls of your feet. In the same hour in a different part of town, Lily crossed the park again and saw Holden still there writing laws for himself in ink. It made her want to believe that proximity to ambition didn't have to threaten the part of you that tells the truth. She told him so briefly before leaving him to the quiet that makes decisions stick. Night threw a shawl over Genoa City and threads that had spent the daylight running parallel began to twist. A message passed through a channel Adam hated, but trusted, the kind that leaves no screenshot, hinting that the ledger trail from Nice had a domestic mirror and that the mirror's first fingerprints belonged to a boutique advisory firm with a habit of renting legitimacy by the hour. It was the kind of breadcrumb that inflames impatience, and Adam had to swallow the old urge to sprint alone into the dark. He forwarded it to Nick with a 2-word caption that amounted to a treaty. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. You first. While they drafted separately and together versions of the question they would put to Victor when he was reachable, Sally Spectra texted Lily a small proof-of-life photo from inside a rehearsal room. Fabric pinned, light tested, a smile earned, and Lily, who believes in letting good news survive on bad days, set back a note that said simply, "You're ready." In a different room, Billy took a call from his private investigator and learned the thing that reformulates days. Victor and Kane would not be in public tonight, which meant the outcome would be decided in private and announced only by tremors. He looked at the wall where he kept the boring schedules that protect the beautiful ones and decided to print a fresh copy. Because the act of taping paper to a wall can feel like control, somewhere between midnight and the kind of tired that makes people tell themselves the truth. The next set of choices arrived. Victor could either press now, force the pipe to groan and let the groan point at the bend, or wait, let patience drill a hole. Silence could not patch. He chose the middle path. He alone knows how to walk, pressing quietly, the way a hand on a sternum reminds a heartbeat it has an audience. Kane matched him, neither submissive nor reckless, and discovered that respect, though rarer than fear, is a more reliable propellant. In that same hour, Adam and Nick composed their bid for recalibration. A pitch that would not sound like doubt, but like stewardship. They would argue to their father that control isn't only about steering the storm, it's about deciding which storms you teach your name to. If they succeeded, the alliance would be narrowed, the exposure minimized, the prize unchanged. If they failed, they would build braces under the floors and tell themselves that family is the practice of standing anyway. And just before dawn, when the sky turns the color of a decision finalized, Lily woke with a start because the body knows when a day will demand all of it. She remembered the look on Kane's face when she said the children's names and hoped that the look meant something would change. She remembered Holden's quiet when he wrote his rules and hoped the quiet would hold. She remembered Victor's shadow as it cut across the coffee shop and hoped that whatever plan marched under it would leave more intact than it broke. It is the nature of this city that hope and caution share a spine. She swung her bag over her shoulder like a promise and walked into a morning that would either vindicate their better angels or feed their worst habits. Somewhere, Adam and Nick were already in cars, rehearsing variables. Somewhere, Victor was already at a window reading the day, like other men read the weather. Somewhere, Kane was already trimming the edges of a choice into something he could live with. Somewhere, Holden was already on his way to a job that might make him or mark him. And across town in a studio full of light, Sally stepped into the navy velvet and became the exact proof the city keeps forgetting it needs: evidence that even when empires scheme and alliances bend an old castle's whisper, people still build things designed to be seen, and that sometimes the cleanest answer to a bad plan is to make a good one visible enough to be undeniable. The episode of The Young and the Restless on May 25, 2025, unfolds a complex web of corporate intrigue, personal tensions, and strategic maneuvering within Genoa City's elite families and businesses. The narrative centers around escalating conflicts involving Victor Newman, Kane, and the intertwined fates of Chancellor Winters, Abbott Communications, and Newman Enterprises. As Victor and Kane engage in a clandestine alliance on a private train, their fragile cooperation signals a potential upheaval with widespread implications. Lily Winters leads a cautious defense of her company, Chancellor Winters, mindful of the vulnerabilities that proximity to power invites. Meanwhile, Holden, Novak, caught between ambition and risk, vows to maintain distance to protect himself and those around him. Nick and Adam Newman debate their father Victor's bold moves, weighing the risks of alliance with Kanan, unpredictable and dangerous figure, known for ruthless tactics. Their dialogue reveals deep concerns about collateral damage to family brands and the volatile nature of Kane's involvement. Sally Spectra and Billy Abbott prepare for the launch of Abbott Communications, balancing excitement with the looming threat of sabotage, as they build resilient contingency plans to protect their venture against potential covert attacks. Throughout the episode, characters grapple with the tension between control and chaos, trust and suspicion, transparency and secrecy. Conversations between Lily and Kane delve into personal costs of corporate secrecy, especially on family relationships. Victor and Kane's private discussions highlight their strategic alliances, precarious balancers backed, mingled with lingering distrust. Behind the scenes, unseen forces and shadowy deals add layers of danger to the already fraught environment. The episode closes with a sense of impending collision, corporate, personal, and political, while emphasizing the characters' resolve to define themselves before the inevitable fallout. The launch of Abbott Communications symbolizes hope and resilience amid uncertainty, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to build and persevere even when surrounded by schemes and shifting alliances. Lily Winters confronts Holden, Novak about his proximity to Kane and potential corporate risks. Nick and Adam Newman debate the risks and benefits of Victor's secretive alliance with Kane on a private train. Sally Spectra and Billy Abbott prepare for the Abbott Communications launch, balancing excitement with caution. Lily Winters orders mitigation steps to protect Chancellor Winters from potential sabotage. Victor and Kane negotiate the terms of their alliance aboard a private train, blending respect with strategic wariness. Lily confronts Kane about secrecy's impact on his children, emphasizing the personal costs of corporate maneuvering. Victor and Kane choose a cautious middle path in their alliance, while Nick and Adam prepare to advocate for restraint, corporate chessboard and risk management. Lily's interrogation of Holden Novak reveals how personal relationships and casual interactions can be weaponized in corporate warfare. Her approach underscores the critical importance of isolating risk variables and protecting supply chains and launch schedules in high-stakes environments. It demonstrates that in business, reputations may recover, but operational disruptions have lasting consequences. Strategic debate between Nick and Adam Newman, their contrasting philosophies. Nick favoring stability and Adam endorsing precision strikes, highlight the complexity of managing family businesses entangled in volatile alliances. This debate reflects the tension between cautious stewardship and aggressive tactics, illustrating that leadership often requires balancing immediate tactical gains against long-term risks to reputation and family legacy. Creative energy versus corporate pressure. Sally and Lee's preparations for Abbott Communications launch symbolize hope and renewal amid corporate strife. Their careful choreography of the launch plans and contingency rehearsals reveals how creativity and business acumen must coexist to navigate external threats, showing that resilience is as much about mindset as it is about logistics. Proactive crisis management. Lily's layered approach duplicated vendor pathways. Staggered freight, pre-written messaging reflects best practices in crisis preparedness, illustrating how anticipation and redundancy are crucial in mitigating sabotage risks. This reveals the importance of building systems that assume interference rather than hope for smooth sailing, a lesson applicable across industries. Alliance fraught with mutual suspicion. The private train meeting between Victor and Kane encapsulates the delicate balance of respect and distrust in high-stakes negotiations. Their mutual understanding of boundaries and consequences underscores how power dynamics in corporate alliances often hinge on unspoken rules and strategic restraint to avoid mutual destruction. Personal costs of secrecy. Lily's confrontation with Kane about his children's perceptions of his secrecy provides a poignant personal costs of secrecy. Lily's confrontation with Kane about his children's perceptions of his secrecy provides a poignant insight into how corporate decisions ripple into personal lives. It highlights the emotional toll of power games and the generational impact of mistrust within families, emphasizing that leadership decisions extend beyond boardrooms into the realm of human relationships. The hidden ledger and historic shadow networks. Nick's revelation about the castle and its past owners introduces a layer of historic clandestine dealings that complicate the current conflict. This insight into legacy infrastructures of illicit influence demonstrates how past decisions and hidden networks continue to shape present corporate battles, reminding viewers that contemporary conflicts often have deep historical roots. Choosing which storms to weather. Adam and Nick's conversation about controlling storms metaphorically captures the essence of strategic leadership, knowing when to engage and when to restrain. It underscores the value of stewardship that balances ambition with prudence, and the necessity of preparing for fallout even when confident in the strategy. Reflecting maturity in crisis navigation, resilience as visible proof. The episode closes with Sally stepping into the navy velvet dress, symbolizing the power of visibility and resilience. It conveys the message that amidst schemes and alliances, creating something undeniable and beautiful is an act of defiance and hope, reinforcing the idea that legacy is shaped not only by power but also by the willingness to be seen and remembered for one's creations. This episode masterfully weaves together corporate intrigue, family dynamics, and personal stakes, illustrating how power, trust, and resilience intersect in the high-pressure world of Genoa City's elite.